it is characterized by spongiosis and marked intracellular edema of the epidermis and dendritic antigen-presenting cells in the epidermis, such as your Langerhans cells, and they exhibit surface-bound IgE molecules with cell processes that reach into the upper epidermis to sense allergens and pathogens. So these antigen-presenting cells play an important role in the cutaneous response to type 2 immune responses. So this is your, how do I Okay, so this is your atopic dermatitis. So if you do not have any lesions yet, this is what would happen. So first, there would be the introduction of your allergens. And then once that one would come in contact with your skin, there would be eventually a disrupted barrier, and your Langerhans cells and your dendritic cells would catch these allergens. And then they would present it to the T helper cells, but they have the predisposition to produce interleukin 4 so that the Th2 would be produced. And then, the development of your Th2, wherein your B cell would be the one to produce that one, then they would produce more of your IgE. So this one. So once again, your allergen would come in contact with your skin. So there would be faster production now of your IgE. And then once it comes in contact with your mast cells, they would produce several factors like this would disrupt eventually your skin barrier. So there would be a decrease in your filaggrin, loricrin, and your involucrin. And once the patient would keep on scratching, so that would be a cycle. So there is what we call as an itch and scratch cycle for those with atopic dermatitis. So there would be skin thickening. So as you can see here, the dermis would already be starting to be edematous. And these patients, since their skin barrier is already disrupted, they are much more prone to having bacterial infections on the skin. And that would also increase your cytokines and your chemokines. And once the patient would keep on scratching, eventually there would be lichenification or skin thickening. And then eventually there would be inflammatory markers as well coming from your Th1. So for the pathogenesis of your atopic dermatitis, it is an IgE-mediated sensitization. There is elevated eosinophils, an increased Th2 cytokine, which is your interleukin 4 and 13, to switch the isotype to IgE synthesis. For those with non-atopic type of atopic dermatitis, they are non-IgE mediated, but they still have elevated eosinophilia, and they have higher interleukin 17 and interleukin 23. So do not worry about the interleukins. You do not need to memorize them. So for the pathogenesis, the hallmark is severely dry skin due to compromise of the epithelial barrier, leading to excess transepidermal water loss, allergen penetration, and microbial colonization. The filaggrin is a structural protein, and this is critical for the skin barrier function. So those patients who have decrease in the filaggrin, so that's why their skin is very dry. And they have the risk of bacterial, viral, fungal infections related to the impairment of innate immunity, disturbance in the microbiome, skin epithelial dysfunction, and overexpression of polarized immune pathways, which dampen host antimicrobial responses. So for the clinical manifestation, so it can start as early as infancy, but there are still adult patients that would have the adult onset of your AD. But usually they have a history already of your atopic dermatitis early on. And 50% presents early in the first year of life and 30% by 1 to 5 years old. So the cardinal features would be intense pruritus and cutaneous reactivity. So food, aeroallergens, infection, reduced humidity, excessive sweating, and irritants trigger pruritus and scratching. So this is your how to diagnose your atopic dermatitis. So these are your typical skin lesions. For acute lesions, they are intensely pruritic. So as you can see, this patient has scratch marks on the skin. And then it's very erythematous. And then there are papules. So they are already confluent na. And then for subacute, so there is excoriations, scaling, papules, and it is erythematous. While for your chronic atopic dermatitis, you can mostly see this one in adults. So they have lichenification already, thick, dry skin, like an elephant skin. And then fibrotic papules, excoriations, dry, pale, pasty skin, and all skin types may appear. So they might still have the acute rashes on different areas of their body. So for the pattern of your AD, mostly in infants, you can see them in the face and then in the extensors on limbs and trunk. While older children, you can already see them in your flexures. Okay, so here. And then in adolescents and adults, you can mostly see the lichenified excoriated plaques at flexures, wrist, ankles, head, trunk, shoulders, and scalp. So for the diagnosis, we still mostly use the Hanifin and Rika criteria, but the dermatologists have their different diagnosis, but it's still based on the Hanifin and Rika criteria. So you must have at least three of the basic features. So these are your major features of your atopic dermatitis. So 3 out of 4. So you need to have pruritus, the typical morphology and distribution. So the one slide before this one, the flexural lichenification in adults, the facial and extensor eruptions in infants and children. So atopic dermatitis is a chronic and relapsing dermatitis. So it would wean, and then after a while, when the patient would keep on scratching, allergens would be exposed, then they would have their dermatitis again. And the fourth criteria would be a personal or a family history of atopy. So most of the time, the patient would fulfill the 4 criteria, but you need to have at least 3. And then the most common feature would be your pruritus. So you will question the diagnosis of your atopic dermatitis if you do not have any pruritus. So these are the minor features of your Hanifin and Rika. You have cirrhosis or dry skin, hyperlinearity or keratosis pilaris, your they call this your chicken skin. So if you had the skin testing done, then that's another criteria. Elevated serum IgE, early age onset, possible skin infections, and tendency towards nonspecific hand and foot dermatitis. Nipple eczema, it's mostly seen for those less than a year old. Chylitis, dryness on the side of the lip. Recurrent conjunctivitis, because again, your atopic dermatitis would be associated with other types of your allergic diseases. So you have conjunctivitis, your Denny-Morgan fold. So you will get to see that one later. When the patient would keep on scratching their eyes, there would be presence of the Denny-Morgan fold, keratoconus, subcapsular cataracts, orbital darkening, facial pallor, anterior neck folds, it's just when sweat, intolerance to wool and lipid solvents, food intolerance, and course is influenced by environmental and emotional factors, and white dermatographism. So when you scratch the skin, you would see the white area, okay, coming from your scratch. So that's a very dry skin as well. So for the differential diagnosis, although some of these would go hand in hand with your atopic dermatitis, especially your seborrheic dermatitis, and then your irritant contact dermatitis. So we will get to see those cases later as well. And then the impetigo, scabies. So those are the most common differential diagnosis for your skin atopic dermatitis. And this one also, but you also need to rule out skin or vitamin deficiencies or nutritional deficiencies, because I was also referred once that there was dermatitis on the patient, and then when I checked, it was due to kwashiorkor. So the patient was very malnourished and the skin was breaking off. So you need to rule out the other diseases as well. So for the management, the first line management would be to reduce the number and severity of flares to maximize disease-free periods with no minimal side effect therapy. And the multi-pronged approach would be skin hydration, topical anti-inflammatory medication, antibacterial measures, elimination of exacerbating factors such as your irritants, allergens, and emotional stress. So sometimes these patients, especially the adult, would keep on saying, Doc, I have this atopic dermatitis. And then when you try to ask them, are you stressed right now? Yes, I'm very stressed at work. And then this is the time that my itching sana kanang became severe. So the management is to control the pruritus, because once you keep on scratching, there is what you call as the itch and scratch cycle as well. So this is an important part of the treatment. So dry skin in winter or cold months damages the stratum corneum barrier and causing increased susceptibility to irritants, and increased itching. Sweating in warm, humid months can trigger itching. So as you can see here, so once you keep on scratching, so the skin barrier would break, allergens would tend to come in more, and there would be more infections so possible for this patient. So for the skin hydration, patients have impaired skin barrier function from reduced filaggrin and skin lipid levels, and they present with diffuse abnormal dry skin and cirrhosis, and moisturizers are the first line therapy. So for the skincare, you need to, but what I usually do is you will give them a bath less than 10 minutes, because the moisture would also to not come out of their skin if ever you bathe them for more than 10 minutes. And then right after, apply the lotion or barrier creams, which contains ceramides and filaggrin acid metabolites. So these are your topical steroid. These have your different strength. So the least potent would be your group 6 and 7. So these are your mild corticosteroids. So these composes your hydrocortisone, and then your mid potent would be your type level 3 or level 4, and then your super potent would be your 2 and 1 and 2. So you would check your, or when you apply these steroids, topical steroids, you need to check what type of what type of defect or what type of thickness they have on their skin lesions. And then you also have to take note that your face, your palm, your the diaper area of your patients. So you need to give only your mild corticosteroids, because these areas are very thin. So you might make your skin hypertrophied if ever. So you don't need to memorize also this one, but I'll just show you the most common ones in each classification. So your least potent, you have your hydrocortisone. And then your class 6, you have your desonide. So that's what we have here. And then in the mid strength, you have your mometasone. And then usually I just use the mometasone. And then you have to differentiate it because as you can see here, your mometasone cream or lotion. And then when you go into the two potent, you have here your mometasone ointment. Okay, in probably in dermatology, so they would teach you if ever the wound is open, then you apply the cream. Is that correct? And then the ointment if it is the dry lesion. But for steroids, this is not the case. You need to check the strength or the potency of your topical corticosteroids. And your super potent would be your clobetasol and your halobetasol. But I don't usually use this one for the patients. So the systemic adverse effects of your topical steroids would be the possible suppression of your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, but this is rare. So this is much more common if you take your oral steroids. So the most common local adverse effects would be the development of your striae and atrophy of the skin, perioral dermatitis, rosacea, and allergic contact dermatitis. So once control of your AD is achieved with daily regimen of your topical corticosteroid, long-term control can be maintained with twice weekly application of your low potency corticosteroids to areas that have healed or are prone to eczema. So what I usually do, so for example, the lesion of your patient needs to have a moderate type of your topical steroid. So I will give the mometasone cream. And after 2 weeks of the application of your mometasone cream, then I would lower down it now to desonide or hydrocortisone. And then once the skin lesion would heal, you can have a proactive treatment or a prophylactic treatment of twice daily application of your hydrocortisone or desonide to those areas which are very much prone to your atopic dermatitis. So this is your fingertip unit. So this is how you would apply your topical corticosteroids. So you need not to put a very thick area because sometimes the patients would think that if I make the medicine very thick, maybe it will heal much more quickly. Okay, so this is how we would do it. So this is one fingertip. So for the that this would also depend on the age group, okay? So for the face and the neck, this would be one fingertip unit for a 3 to 6 month old. But for that of an adult, the whole head would need 2.5 fingertip unit. And then if ever the trunk is involved, for example, in an adult, you need to have 7 fingertip units if ever the whole area is involved. So you just need a small amount. So other topical medications other than your steroids would be your topical calcineurin inhibitors. This inhibits activity of your calcineurin, a calcium-dependent phosphatase, and the translocation of your transcription factor, nuclear factor, of activated T cells into the cell nucleus, blocking the initiation of your nuclear factor. Your nuclear factor is also one factor that would release all the chemokines, cytokines, like that, with regards to the skin barrier of your patients with atopic dermatitis. So this inhibits the activation of your T cells involved in your atopic dermatitis. But the common adverse effect would be a local burning sensation. So there are two preparations, your 0.03 and your 0.1. And this is approved as a short-term and intermediate long-term use in those children above 2 years old. It is non atropogenic and has a greater therapeutic margin of safety than medium-strength glucocorticoids for facial and eyelid edema. And then you also have another one, which is your pimecrolimus. This is given also to mild to moderate atopic dermatitis. So I've had patients who are steroid phobic. So this is what I would give them because this is non-steroidal. So other management would be your tar preparation, but I have not given this one. It has an antipyretic and anti-inflammatory property. So you can also use your tar shampoo in the scalp. And antihistamine, this may reduce histamine-induced pruritus. And histamine is only one of the many mediators released during inflammatory response that induces pruritus. So it might be that a sedating antihistamine may offer an advantage when used at bedtime. But you need to um, also have a case-to-case basis. Like, for example, if the child wakes up at nighttime due to severe scratching, but in the morning, not so much. So you can give the sedating antihistamine at bedtime. But what I usually give is the non-sedating antihistamine still. Because sometimes these sedating antihistamines would also have a side effect, like the other patients would have hyperreactivity. So other management would be your phosphodiesterase inhibitor. I also have not used this one. Systemic vitamin D supplementation might be of benefit in those symptoms which appears to worsen during the winter. So we don't have winter here. And dilute bleach bath might reduce the need for systemic antibiotic in heavily colonized patients. So the systemic corticosteroids are sometimes given, but I seldom use this one because most of the time they would appear to have a very good effect, but then there would be a severe rebound flare up after discontinuation. That's why a short course followed by proactive topicals are needed if ever you would use your oral corticosteroids. So another medicine, but we don't have it here yet in the Philippines. So this is your dupilumab. It is a monoclonal antibody that binds to the interleukin-4 receptor alpha subunit that inhibits the signaling of your interleukin-4 and 13. So this reduces the pruritus and improves skin clearing for those more than 6 years old. Phototherapy, I have not used this one also. So natural sunlight, no sweat, and sunburn may benefit. So it is reserved for failed standard treatment. And the short-term adverse effect would be your erythema, skin pain, pruritus, and pigmentation. And long-term adverse effect would be predisposition of cutaneous malignancies. So other management would be your cyclosporin. I have not used this one also. It suppresses the cytokine gene transcription, and this is reserved for severe refractory atopic dermatitis. And JK inhibitors or Janus kinase, we don't also have it here. It is a topical and oral form that demonstrates improvements for severe AD in adults and older children. So unproven therapy, you have your interferon gamma, omalizumab, allergen immunotherapy. I use allergen immunotherapy, but for those patients who have allergic rhinitis and asthma, and when they also manifest the atopic dermatitis. But if for atopic dermatitis alone, there's lesser studies on that one. Probiotics, there's still a lot of research to be done as well, herbal medications and vitamin D. So other management would be to identify and eliminate the triggering factors. So it is important to identify and avoid irritants that trigger the itch-scratch cycle. So soaps, detergents, chemicals, abrasive clothing, extremes in temperature and humidity. So soaps used should be minimal defatting activity and with a neutral pH. So these are seen in your book. I'm not promoting them. Okay. So other management would be to identify, again, the elimination of triggers. So new clothes should be laundered before wearing to decrease the level of formaldehyde and other chemicals added for fabric sizing. Occlusive tight clothing should be avoided, and the patient should be advised to wear open weave, loose fitting cotton or cotton blend garments. So prolonged sun exposure can also lead to evaporative losses or sweating, both of which can be irritating and can produce photo damage. Sunscreens can be irritants as well. So you need to have a mild sunscreen as well when you apply it. So for your food and aero allergens, like your dust mites, animal allergens, and pollens might also trigger your ED. So food allergy triggered are more common in young infants and children than in adults, while in children less than 5 years old with moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, you need to evaluate for the milk, egg, peanut, wheat, and soy allergy. So complications, so they are very much prone to having skin infections, be it bacterial, viral, or fungal. And then they would have peeling of their skin, so exfoliative dermatitis. When they keep on scratching their eyes, they are at risk of having atopic keratoconjunctivitis, keratoconus, and they have decreased quality of life due to their incessant scratching. So preventive measures would be breastfeeding at least 6 months and early introduction of your food allergens as early as 4 to 6 months. And emollient therapy to whole body to enhance cutaneous barrier and reduce the risk of your atopic dermatitis. So that's for your atopic dermatitis. Do you have questions? Nan, can you type your questions, Nan? Do you have questions? None on the chat box. No questions. I'll open my next lecture lang. No questions. No questions na? And also for yesterday's lecture di ay.
Wala.
None, Radok.
Okay. So I'll proceed to the next one. I think this would be your case as well in your clinics. Is my slide moving?
Yes, Doc.
Doc.
Thank you. So second topic would be allergic rhinitis and its impact on asthma. So as what I mentioned earlier, your allergic rhinitis is related to your asthma. So allergic rhinitis or AR is a chronic inflammatory disease affecting 20 to 30% of children. So it is marked by nasal congestion, rhinorrhea, itching, and is often accompanied by sneezing and conjunctival inflammation. This is associated with a threefold increase in the risk for asthma at an older age. And the risk factors would be family history of atopy, serum IgE of more than 100,000 international units before 6 years old, prenatal tobacco smoke, heavy exposure to indoor allergens, CS-born delivered children, and reduced diversity of your gut microbiota. So factors that protect the the development of your allergy would be exposure to pet dander and endotoxins in early childhood protects against the development of your allergies, prolonged breastfeeding, and early introduction of rye, wheat, oats, fish, and eggs. So contrary to the one believed before that you should delay your allergenic food, so by this time the research would already tell you to do otherwise. Okay, sorry. So for the etiology, there are two factors necessary for your AR expression. That would be sensitivity of an allergen and the presence of an allergen in the environment. So you need to have an exposure first to the allergen. And when you get to be exposed with that one, so you would have the manifestations of your allergic rhinitis. So there are different categories. You have your intermittent and persistent. So you will get to see this one later. These are mostly caused by your pollens, rust, weeds, and spores. But for those persistent, usually your indoor allergens like your dust mites, animal dander, and cockroaches. So the classification of your allergic rhinitis, first off, is your intermittent symptoms. So you need to ask your patient if how many days in a week do you have your nasal congestion, rhinorrhea, kanang watery nasal discharge, like that. So if it's just less than 4 days a week and then less than a month, so that would be your intermittent. But if you have your persistent symptoms, it is more than 4 days and more than 4 weeks. Okay. And then for your mild symptoms, your patient would just have normal sleep, normal daily activities, sports or leisure, no absences from work or school, and no troublesome symptoms. But for those patients with moderate to severe, you need to have at least one of the following. So they cannot sleep properly because their nose is very congested. They cannot go to work because they are very sleepy, or their daily activities is affected because they are very tired, they have plugged nose, they don't feel well. So problems caused at work or school and troublesome symptoms. So for the classification, it can be mild intermittent symptoms or moderate severe intermittent or mild persistent or moderate to severe persistent. So you need to classify your allergic rhinitis in order for you to know what treatment option is available for these patients. So this is your allergic response. So you've already have an overview of this one. So as you can see, there is an antigen or an allergen, and it is being captured by your antigen presenting cells. And it is then so presented to the T cell. It's either you would go into your Th1, this would be your inflammation, but for those patients who are prone to having allergies, they will be presented to the T helper 2 cells. So, and then your cytokines and your chemokines would tell your B cells to produce your IgE for that certain allergen. And then, so your IgE antibodies, they are already sometimes present in your mast cells. So when the antigen would be exposed to the IgE on the mast cells, there would be release of your inflammatory mediators, and this would cause your allergic inflammation. So once the allergen would come in contact with your IgE on the mast cells, your mast cells would then have degranulation within minutes. And after there would be degranulation, so there would be histamine, leukotriene, and cytokine release. And then, so that's your immediate reaction. And then for several hours, there will still be secretion of your cytokines and chemokines. And this is your late phase reactions. So again, the pathophysiology, you already know this one, but the initial response would have a vasodilation, vascular leakage, smooth muscle spasms. And your late phase reaction, you have your mucosal edema, mucus secretion, leukocyte infiltration, epithelial damage, and bronchospasm. So the symptoms of your allergic rhinitis would be anterior or posterior rhinorrhea, sneezing, nasal blockage, itching of the nose, which occurs more than or equal to 2 consecutive days for more than 1 hour on most days. So in allergy, we mostly have our magic number would be 4. So these are your 4 symptoms of your allergic rhinitis. So do not forget this one. Anterior or posterior rhinorrhea, sneezing, nasal blockage, or itching of the nose. Diba earlier, we had your atopic dermatitis, your pruritus, your predilected skin area, chronic and relapsing, and a family history. So we have the magic number 4. So for the physical examination, so the general appearance would be a facial pallor. So this one, the patient looks pale. Other than that, you have your allergic shiners for this patient. And then this one is also opening his mouth. This kid is opening his mouth. So that's mouth breathing. So for the eyes, this one also has the allergic shiners. But other than that, you have your Danny Morgan folds. And evidence of conjunctivitis. So the eyes are a little bit red, coming from chronic scratching. And then this one also here, it's a little bit edematous. The eyes are edematous, coming from chronic scratching as well. So you saw this one yesterday, the allergic salute. So they have the anterior nasal crease coming from the chronic scratching of the nose. And then you have your pale mucus. It's your mucus pale boggy turbinates. So for the physical examination, so for the mouth, so this is your hyper arch palate. So this is your normal not palate. This one there. It is associated with chronic mouth breathing, tonsillar hypertrophy, lymphoid streaking in the oropharynx, post-nasal drip, and halitosis. So your skin, you can still have your atopic dermatitis. So this is your cobblestoning for this one, and that is your post-nasal drip. Okay, if you have bubbling or even if you can see the mucoid dripping from the back of the throat, that is your post-nasal drip. So other signs and symptoms would be headache, anosmia. So most of them would have the complication already of your sinusitis. They are much more prone to having upper respiratory tract infection, wheezing because they have post-nasal drip. They have the tendency also to have already the asthma, and then bronchial edema and itching. So the different classification as well of your rhinitis would be either infectious, so coming from your viral infections. So allergic, that's our topic today. Occupational, so for example, in gasoline stations, so they have noxious chemicals, very strong odor of the gasoline or diesel. So they are also prone to having rhinitis. So drugs, the most common one would be your aspirin. Hormones, so changes in the hormones. For example, the mother or the mother is pregnant, and then during the time of pregnancy, she is much more prone to having asthma, but it also it could be the other way around. Like for example, the that patient pre-pregnancy has a asthma exacerbation, but during pregnancy, there is also resolution of the asthma or rhinitis. So non-allergic rhinitis, if ever you get to do your allergy test and it is negative, so that's what we call as non-allergic rhinitis. It's more of the irritants rather than your allergens. So the smoke, the strong odors, the fumes in the car, car exhaust, like that. For your atrophic rhinitis, so this is seen in elderly. So because of the dry nares that they have, so they might produce allergic rhinitis. And then idiopathic, so na- even if you exhausted yourself with trying to eliminate what could be the trigger, so there is your idiopathic rhinitis. So this is how we would do or how we would classify your rhinitis. So if you have a positive skin prick test, then that would be your allergic rhinitis. If it's non-allergic or if it's negative, so that would be your non-allergic. For your occupational, you just need to have your history. Okay, so when the patient would come home, there would be resolution of your symptoms. But when they come back to their work, they would have their symptoms. So if you're non-allergic, you need to rule out first your infections. So you can have your sinusitis or chronic rhinosinusitis. But for those non-infective types of your rhinitis, you can have your nares or your non-allergic rhinitis with eosinophilia. So consider aspirin and topi. This is done by, for example, getting a swab on the nose, and then you would get to see eosinophils on the microscope. So immunologic findings, mostly granuloma, SLE, or relapsing polychondritis. So others would be structural abnormalities. So you can refer that to your ENT. For hormonal, pregnancy, menstrual cycle, you need to check if it is also associated with during menstruation of the patient. Drug-induced, those patients taking oral contraceptives, aspirin, cocaine, antihypertensive. So you need to get a good history for those. So others, I have cases of having allergic rhinitis and asthma, but this was caused by GERD. So you need to treat the GERD in order for you to treat your rhinitis. So these are the differential diagnosis. So mechanical factors, tumors, granuloma, ciliary defects, CSF rhinorrhea, and other types of rhinorrhea. So complications would be chronic sinusitis is the most common complication, but usually they have negative bacterial cultures, marked mucosal thickening, sinus opacification. And they usually impact the quality of life because of chronic headache, um, blockage of the nose, etc. And children may be frustrated with their appearance because they have their allergic shiners, like that. So another factor would be your aspirin exacerbated respiratory disease. So there would be chronic rhinosinusitis with nasal polyposis, asthma, and aspirin sensitivity. So rhinitis is almost always seen in patients with asthma. Okay. So that's what we call as the one airway disease. So most of the time, these patients have nasal congestion. So they would have a shift from the nose to mouth breathing and post-nasal drip inflammatory mediators into the lower airways. And then there is chronic nasobronchial reflex. So the patient would keep on coughing. And then there would be systemic absorption of your inflammatory mediators and cytokines. So these factors would then present to your lungs, and then they would have they are much more prone to your asthma. So to diagnose, you need to coordinate between the typical history and allergic symptoms and diagnostic tests. So again, your four symptoms would be rhinorrhea, sneezing, nasal obstruction, pruritus, and a family history. And ocular symptoms are common. Diagnostic tests are based on allergen-specific IgE. So again, we need to do the skin testing. It is widely demonstrates the IgE-mediated allergic reaction of the skin and represents a major diagnostic tool in the field of allergy. So what I do is the scratch test at the clinic. Atopy patch tests are for non-allergenic types like your nickel, gold, silver, etc. They are irritants. So other diagnostics would be your serum total IgE. It should no longer be used for screening because it's much more better to have your specific IgE because it would target your dust mites like that, etc. And then your nasal challenge tests are usually done in research purposes only. So for the management, you need to get rid of your triggers. So we have four management as well for your allergic rhinitis. So environmental control and allergen avoidance. So if ever you would have a positive dog allergen, so you need to, as much as possible, remove the dog at home or the cat at home. So the most common one would be your dust mites and cockroaches, and then your pollen allergy as well. So you need to educate your patient. So for the dust mite control, you need to change your beddings at least once a week. Put a damp cloth to decrease the dust load. Avoidance of stuffed toys because they are dust collectors as well as carpets. And then you launder your clothes and also your bed sheets, pillowcases above 55 degrees Celsius because if it's above 55 degrees, the dust mites would be killed off as well. And then this is how to decrease the cockroach load in the cockroach load at home. So you need to have a cockroach bait station. So rather than spraying, it's not advisable to have a spray. So that's why you need to have a cockroach bait. So the third management would be your pharmacologic. So earlier, we already knew how to classify your severity of your allergic rhinitis. So this is where it will go. If you have your mild intermittent, the first line of your treatment would be your oral or local non-sedative antihistamine. And you can add an intranasal decongestant if ever your patient manifests your nasal congestion. So if ever you have nasal congestion, you can give your nasal decongestant or an oral decongestant. And you avoid and irritant, allergen and irritant avoidance as well. And then you would reassess. And then for those patients with moderate to severe intermittent, mild persistent, and moderate to severe persistent, your first line would be an intranasal steroid. You can add on an anti-leukotriene. You can also add on an oral or local non-sedative antihistamine, and you can also add your decongestant. But what is different from this one, other than your intranasal steroid and leukotriene, would be your immunotherapy. So I will discuss the immunotherapy as well later on. So other therapeutic options would be a second generation oral antihistamine to reduce the sneezing, itching, and rhinorrhea when taken regularly at the time of maximal symptoms or before exposure to an allergen. And intranasal corticosteroids, they effectively reduce inflammation of the nasal mucosa and improve mucosal pathology. And you can use your leukotriene to decrease your leukotriene, your Montelukast. Those are your Montelukast. So the fourth therapy would be your immunotherapy. It is a well-defined treatment for IgE-mediated allergic disease. It is allergen specific So it is either administered subcutaneously, but we already have our oral immunotherapy as well. So it needs to have a precise diagnosis of IgE mediated allergy, and this is effective in adults and children 4 years old and up, especially for pollen and mild allergy. So the allergen-specific immunotherapy may alter the natural course of allergic diseases, reduce development of new sensitization, and is effective after several years of cessation. So this is considered if pharmacologic therapy is not effective or avoidance is difficult. So most of the time, the dust mite load is very high at home, and then despite the patients taking their nasal or taking their antihistamines, doing their nasal spray, they still have their symptoms. So those are the patients that needs to have the immunotherapy. It also reduces the development of your asthma, and the build-up phase is usually 4 weekly injections, and the maintenance phase is given monthly injection for 3 years. While there is a sublingual oral therapy, you need to spray it daily, and there's also a tablet form for your house dust mite. You need to take the tablets once a day as well. So other treatment options would be your omalizumab. If your IgE is very high, so dupilumab, we don't have it here. Some would offer improvement with saline solution and your oxymetazoline, a nasal decongestant. So prevention, should exclusive breastfeeding be used in infants to prevent allergy? So yes. So, should antigen avoidance diet be used in pregnant or breastfeeding women to prevent development of allergy in children? So, the answer is no. So, you need to introduce early on the allergenic food. So, should children and pregnant women avoid environmental tobacco smoke to reduce the risk of developing allergy, wheezing, and asthma in children? So, very much yes. So should infants and preschool children avoid exposure to house dust mites to reduce the risk of developing dust mite allergy and asthma? So yes. And then if they are positive, of course. But there is what we call as the hygiene hypothesis now that we discussed yesterday. So should infants and preschool children avoid exposure to pets at home to reduce the risk of developing allergy? So no. So as much as possible, if they are not allergic, then they can still have pets at home. So should specific measures reducing occupational agent exposure be used to decrease the risk of sensitization and subsequent development of occupational rhinitis and asthma? So yes. So in conclusion, allergic rhinitis is a common disorder that can significantly impact the patient's quality of life. And diagnosis is made through a comprehensive history and physical examination. Diagnostic testing using skin prick or allergen-specific IgE test is usually required to confirm the underlying allergies causing the rhinitis. And second generation oral antihistamines and intranasal corticosteroids are the mainstay treatment for this disorder. And allergen immunotherapy is an effective immune modulating treatment that should be recommended if pharmacologic therapy of allergic rhinitis is not effective or is not tolerated. So therapy with medications improves quality of life, and there is a 10 to 23% remission in children. Questions?
And so far, Doc.
No questions, Ram. Okay. Sige, third topic. I'll just make this one fast. So urticaria and so urticaria and angioedema affects 20% of individuals at some point in their lives. And episodes of hives, if it's acute, it lasts for less than 6 weeks. And if it's chronic already, it occurs on most days of the week for more than 6 weeks. And the distinction is important because the causes and mechanism of the urticaria formation and the therapeutic approaches are different in each instance. So for the etiology, the common causes of acute generalized urticaria are food, drugs, particularly antibiotic, and stinging insect venoms. If allergen, example your latex or animal dander, penetrates the skin locally, hives often can develop at the site of exposure. For those non-IgE mediated stimulation of mast cells caused by radiocontrast agents, viral agents, including Hep B or Epstein-Barr virus, opiates, and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. So again, you need to differentiate also your IgE and non-IgE mediated um, inflammation because your non-IgE, it is not allergic. Okay, so for example of your mast cell degranulation would be coming from your vancomycin, your red man syndrome, because there is release of your mast cells, but it is non-allergic. So pruritic raised wheals that blanches with pressure and is transient and resolves without residual lesions unless the area was intensely scratched. So the pathogenesis of your acute urticaria and angioedema IgE-mediated reaction would be from your mast cell activation. So once your mast cell would be activated, it releases your histamine and other mediators, such as your platelet activating factors and your cytokines. And this results in sensory nerve activation, vasodilation, and plasma extravasation, as well as cell recruitment of urticarial lesions. For chronic urticaria, which occurs on most days of the week for more than 6 weeks, are not physical urticaria or recurrent acute urticaria with repeated exposure to a specific agent. And this is accompanied mostly by angioedema. And rarely, angioedema occurs without urticaria. So angioedema without urticaria is often a result of allergy, but recurrent angioedema raises question about other diagnoses. So these are your chronic urticaria subtypes. This is divided into chronic spontaneous urticaria and those inducible urticaria. So when you say inducible urticaria, you need to do something or you are doing something, but your spontaneous, of course, it will just open or it will just appear on its own. So your inducible urticaria would be symptomatic dermographism. So when you scratch your skin, there would be redness. Cold urticaria, so when exposure to cold. Delayed pressure urticaria. For example, the bag of the patient is very heavy and after a while, there would be redness on the area. Solar urticaria, I've had 3 patients already with this one. So upon exposure to sunlight, there would be urticaria on the face as well. Heat urticaria, vibratory angioedema. So for those patients who are drilling, so they can have that vibratory urticaria and angioedema. Cholinergic urticaria when the patient would have fever, so that's cholinergic urticaria. And contact urticaria, so due to venom or plants, etc. And then aquagenic urticaria. I've seen 2 patients also with aquagenic urticaria, but usually most of the time they would be submerged underwater, and then after going out of the water, when exposure to cold air, they would have the generalized urticaria. So to diagnose your urticaria, It is a wheal in patients with urticaria has three typical features. There is a central swelling of variable size, almost invariably surrounded by a reflex erythema, an itching or sometimes burning sensation, a fleeting nature within the skin returning to its normal appearance, usually within 30 minutes to 24 hours. So it would transfer to different areas of the skin, and then it would resolve on its own, and then it would spontaneously go to the other areas again. Unlike your angioedema, in urticaria patients is characterized by a sudden pronounced erythematous or skin-colored swelling of the lower dermis and subcutis or mucous membranes. It is sometimes painful rather than itchy, and there would be a resolution as well. So this is your urticaria, and as you can see, this is your angioedema. So there is swelling already in the lower dermis as well as in your eyes. So compared to this one, it is just in the area of the skin. So urticaria and other terms in the US would be your welts. It is mostly defined border, and then there is redness, especially when you scratch it, and then the rash that turns white when pressed, sorry. And then it may appear in any part of the body. While your angioedema, if it is hereditary angioedema, so you would have headache, dizziness, voice alteration, possible visual alterations or signs of paralysis. For the throat, there would be swelling of the airway, laryngeal edema with difficulty swallowing, change in voice. For the intestinal region, there would be vomiting, abdominal pain, so we might think that the patient is going into anaphylaxis as well. So for the bladder, there is burning sensation when urinating, bladder, lumbar region pain, sometimes similar to UTI. For the genitalia, there would be swelling of the scrotum and the vulva. For cutaneous edema, sensation of tightness, pressure, and swelling. And the extremities, same with swelling and decreased normal mobility and difficulty of walking. Another type of your urticaria would be your urticarial vasculitis. So this is different from that of your plain urticaria. These lesions burn more than they itch, and they would not disappear for more than 24 hours. When you touch it, it's still red. Compared to that of your urticaria, it is pale. And then some would have blister, and some heal with scarring, and some are associated with bleeding on the skin. So an example of this would be your, for example, for your dengue, no, you have your purpura, that one. So it's redness. Even if you touch it, there would still be the lesion there. So to diagnose your urticaria, it usually does not require a diagnostic workup, as it is usually self-limiting. The only exception is the suspicion of an acute urticaria due to type 1 food allergy in sensitized patients or the existence of other eliciting factors such as your NSAIDs. In this case, allergy tests as well as educating the patients may be useful to allow patients to avoid re-exposure of relative causative factors. For the diagnostic workup, so you need to differentiate first if it's an urticaria, you have Schnitzler's syndrome, cyclosporin-associated periodic syndrome. So these would still manifest with your chronic urticaria. So if angioedema, there would be bradykinin-mediated angioedema like angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor-induced angioedema or other non-mast cell-related angioedema. So further diagnostic procedures to reveal underlying causes in patients with long-standing and uncontrolled disease needs to be determined carefully. So these are the diseases related to urticaria, and symptoms that present with hives and angioedema. So you have your maculopapular cutaneous mastocytosis or your urticaria pigmentosa, urticarial vasculitis, bradykinin-mediated angioedema. I had a patient with exercise-induced anaphylaxis already. Your CAPS, there would be rash, fever attacks, arthralgia, and arthritis. Your Schnitzler syndrome is recurrent urticarial rash with monoclonal gammopathy, recurrent fever attacks, bone and muscle pain, arthralgia, or arthritis. And your Gleich syndrome, episodic angioedema with eosinophilia. Your Wells syndrome, granulomatous dermatitis with eosinophilia. And your bolus pemphigoid. So autoimmunity mediated by functional autoantibodies directed against the high affinity IgE receptor or IgE autoantibodies to autoantigen, pseudoallergy, or your non-allergy hypersensitivity reaction to food or drugs, and acute or chronic infections like your H. pylori has been described as causes of your chronic urticaria. So when I get to see patients with chronic urticaria, I ask them if ever they have GERD, or because they don't usually understand the, or I just say hyper in the stomach. So that's when I refer also to the GI to check if they have the H. pylori as well. So it is important to remember that not all possible causative factors need to be investigated in all patients. And the first step in diagnosis is a thorough history taking the following items into consideration. So the time of onset, the shape, size, frequency, duration, and distribution of wheals. Is it associated with angioedema? Are the associated symptoms, for example, with bone, joint pain, fever, and abdominal cramps? So maybe it might be rheumatologic. Is there a family and a personal history regarding wheals and angioedema? So it might be familial. And is there induction by physical agents or exercise? So when I interview the patient, so ongoing interview, I just tell them, I'll just scratch your skin to check if there is dermographism. So occurrence in relation to daytime, weekends, menstrual cycles, holidays, and travel. So be it they are at work, so mostly stress related, or occurrence in relation to food and drugs, so intake of NSAIDs, so you just need to avoid them. Most of the time, the patients would have, what they call this, the ibuprofen, urticaria, or angioedema. And then occurrence in relation to infections and stress. So previous or recurrent allergies, infections, internal or autoimmune diseases, gastric and intestinal problems or other disorders, social and occupational history, leisure activities, previous therapy and response to therapy, including dosage and duration, and previous diagnostic procedures and results. So for your spontaneous urticaria, you have your acute spontaneous urticaria. There needs to be no diagnostic test if it's just acute. You just treat it with antihistamine. But if you already have your chronic spontaneous urticaria, you can start off with your CBC, ESR, and or CRP. And then you just need to check if ever the patient has, for example, thyroid disorders. So you can check for their autoantibodies. And then you need to check for the H. pylori. But this would again, if ever they have that kind of history. Okay, do not routinely do all the laboratory tests. So indicible, you do your cold provocation test, delayed pressure, heat provocation. So I do some in the clinic. I do for all the symptomatic dermographism. I just elicit the scratching on the skin. So the management of your urticaria. So The goal of treatment is to treat the disease until it is gone, and the therapeutic approach to chronic urticaria can involve the identification and elimination of the underlying cause, the avoidance of eliciting factors, the tolerance induction, and the use of pharmacological treatment to prevent mast cell mediator release and or the effects of mast cell mediators. And treatment should follow the basic principles of treating, such as much needed and little as possible. And this may mean stepping up or stepping down in the treatment algorithm according to the course of the disease. So first off, you give your second generation antihistamine. You can give it initially, like for example, once a day. If there is inadequate control after 2 to 4 weeks or earlier, or if symptoms are intolerable, you can increase your second generation antihistamine up to 4 times the dose. But after reassessment, if there is still inadequate control and if symptoms are intolerable, then you add on your second generation plus an omalizumab. And then you refer already to a specialist of this type. So usually it's us allergists that would give the omalizumab. If there is still inadequate control within 6 months or earlier, and if symptoms are intolerable, then you give your cyclosporine. By the way, most of the time, the patients would not be able to do with the omalizumab because this is very expensive. One drug costs around 30,000. And then sometimes the patients would need 2 vials. So that would be 60K in just one injection. And then this is to be given every 2 to 4 weeks. But if the urticaria is already controlled, then you can already have it once a month. But ideally, you would give it twice a month. Okay, that's the last slide then. Do you have questions?
None, Doc.
Actually, for me, urticaria is quite a difficult case because most of the time, you need to investigate what is the trigger. And then most of the time, the patients would keep on saying, Doc, I ate the chicken, the egg, but I keep on telling them it's not the chicken and the egg. Okay, so it's not the, most of the time, it's not the food. So I just keep on explaining to them. And then I usually do workup, and then sometimes even with the intake of the antihistamines, the rashes would still appear. And then sometimes the patient would get frustrated, and then I add on like a steroid on it, but then as much as possible, the steroid should be lowered down, but sometimes they are some would just improve with the steroid and then they cannot afford also the omalizumab. So most of the medications for the allergy are also very expensive. So that's another rate limiting factor for allergic patients. Okay, it's 9 o'clock, almost 9 o'clock. No questions? Okay, thank you. I'll just text tomorrow. I'll just text Rashid. I'll confirm lang if ever I'll be at the saan- I'll be in the in your school tomorrow. Okay, or online.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Doc.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Doc.
Doc.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Doc.
Doc.
Bye.
Bye.